Somewhere deep beneath the surface of the earth, in a cavern hidden from human eyes, something ancient stirred. The time had come once again. Torches flared to life, runes shimmered in the darkness, and with a thunderous boom, the gates to the Goblin Olympics creaked open. Above ground, completely unaware of the chaos about to unfold, 4 penguins were on a mission. Skipper, Kowalski, Rico, and Private had been tracking a stolen artifact, a gleaming golden medallion said to hold great power. After an exhausting chase through the underground tunnels beneath Madagascar, they finally cornered their target, a goblin thief with a sack full of loot. The thief grinned, tossed the metal into the air, and vanished into the shadows. Without hesitation, Rico leaped forward and swallowed the medallion whole. A mistake. A very, very bad mistake. The ground rumbled. The walls shook. A spiral of green fire erupted beneath the penguins' feet, and before they could react, the ground collapsed, sending them tumbling into the abyss. They landed with a splat, not on the hard stone floor, but in a pile of something soft. Feathers, fur, claws. They weren't alone. As the dust settled, they found themselves surrounded by goblins. Hundreds of them, of all shapes and sizes, each more ridiculous looking than the last. Some had too many eyes, others had none. Some wore armor made of pots and pans. Others wielded weapons that looked suspiciously like old plumbing pipes. It was a goblin stadium filled with chanting, screeching, laughing goblins, all gathered for one reason. The Goblin Olympics had begun. At the center of the arena, an enormous stone tablet glowed with arcane energy. Inscribed in twisting goblin runes were the names of every contestant. One by one, goblins marched forward to place their hands upon the stone, their names appearing in shimmering green letters. And then, Rico let out a loud burp. The golden medallion, now glowing with eerie power, lit up from inside his belly. The stone tablet rumbled, sparks crackled, the runes twisted, forming 4 new names. The goblins exploded into cheers. The penguins had accidentally entered the tournament. Before they could escape, 2 enormous goblin guards dragged them to the podium in the center of the stadium. High above, on a throne made of bones and banana peels, the Goblin King loomed, watching them with glowing red eyes. A great bell tolled. The rules were simple. Compete in the Goblin Olympics. Win and earn your freedom. Lose and be transformed into goblins forever. No time to argue, no time to plan. The first event was about to begin. Exploding potato dodgeball. The goblins cheered. The penguins had never been more doomed. A deafening horn blasted through the goblin stadium. The ground trembled as wooden crates burst open, sending hundreds of potatoes rolling onto the field. But these weren't ordinary potatoes. No, that would have been too simple. These potatoes were smoking, some sizzled with green sparks. Others rumbled ominously, as if containing barely contained explosions. A few twitched as if alive. The rules of exploding potato dodgeball were as follows. First, pick up a potato. Second, throw it at your opponent. Third, pray it doesn't explode in your own face. Simple, deadly, goblin approved. The penguins stood frozen as hundreds of goblin athletes lined up against them on the opposite side of the arena. Some cracked their knuckles, others licked their lips. A few casually bit into the potatoes, only to detonate into tiny mushroom clouds of soot and regret. A goblin referee, wearing a tattered top hat, stepped forward, raised a rusted trumpet, and blew. Boom! The game had begun. Potatoes whizzed through the air, detonating on impact. Goblins rolled, leaped, and flung themselves across the battlefield, dodging fiery explosions. The penguins snapped into action. Skipper barked silent orders, scanning the battlefield with military precision. He spotted a goblin in the distance, winding up for a throw. Before the goblin could release, Skipper grabbed a smoldering potato, hurled it like a grenade, and watched as it landed directly in the goblin's arms. A single moment of confusion. Then, kaboom! The goblin soared through the air, flipping majestically before face-planting into a barrel of cheese. 1 down. Hundreds to go. Kowalski, the team's strategist, had no time for calculations. He zigzagged between explosions, his mind racing through probability equations. He picked up a potato, carefully licked his flipper, tested the wind direction, and threw it backward without looking. It hit a goblin right between the eyes. Direct hit. Rico, on the other hand, had a different approach. He ate a potato. The stadium went silent. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, his stomach rumbled. His eyes widened. His entire body shook. With a massive belch, Rico spat the potato out like a cannonball. It whizzed across the battlefield, ricocheting off walls, bouncing off goblins, and finally smashing straight into the referee. The top-hatted goblin exploded into a puff of smoke. The crowd went wild. Private, the smallest of the team, was running for his life. He had no plan, no strategy, just pure, unfiltered panic. A goblin launched a potato his way. Private ducked. The potato zoomed past him, struck a wooden beam, and sent an entire tower collapsing onto the enemy team. It was a beautiful accident. The final moments of the game descended into pure chaos. Smoke filled the air. Goblins launched potatoes blindly. Several threw themselves out of the game, mistaking their own teammates for targets. Finally, the last goblin standing took aim at Skipper. A single, perfectly aimed potato spiraled through the air. Skipper caught it. The goblin gasped. Skipper smiled. He gently rolled the potato back. The goblin, utterly confused, picked it up. Boom! The final goblin was down. The stadium erupted in cheers. Against all odds, the Penguins had won. One event down, many more to go. And next, chicken jousting. The Penguins stared at each other. This was going to get worse before it got better. The goblin crowd roared as a rickety wooden platform rose in the center of the arena. Banners stitched together with questionable materials flapped in the wind, and on them were painted images of chickens in battle armor. Yes, chicken jousting. The Penguins stood frozen, watching as goblins in makeshift night helmets clambered onto massive, feathery war chickens. The birds clucked menacingly, their beady eyes filled with unholy, goblin-infused rage. A goblin announcer, perched on a floating barrel, cleared his throat and raised a trumpet. The crowd hushed. Then he blew the trumpet. The trumpet promptly exploded, and with that, the battle began. Goblins charged forward, lances made of old broomsticks clutched in their tiny hands. Their war chickens flapped wildly, kicking up clouds of dust. The ground trembled under the furious stampede of talons. Skipper was the first to react. He grabbed a wayward goblin, tossed it aside, and seized the reins of a particularly battle-worn chicken. The bird squawked aggressively, but Skipper held firm. He had commanded submarines, tanks, and jet-powered sleds before. A war chicken? Just another day in the field. Meanwhile, Kowalski was trying to apply logic to the situation. Okay! His eyes darted from one end of the battlefield to the other. Jousting involves momentum, balance, and... oh dear. A goblin barreled toward him, waving a battered ladle in place of a weapon. Before Kowalski could react, Rico tackled the goblin mid-air, seized its chicken, and cackled like a maniac. With a dramatic flourish, Rico chomped down on something inside his mouth. What was it? A wrench? A firecracker? A live grenade? No one knew. Boom! A massive plume of smoke exploded beneath his war chicken. Somehow, miraculously, the force blasted Rico forward at terrifying speed. The goblins barely had time to react. One by one, Rico knocked them off their chickens like bowling pins. Some went flying into the stands. Some spiraled into the sky. Some landed in the snack vendor's cauldron. The crowd cheered at this. Apparently, goblins found the idea of accidental soup very amusing. Private, meanwhile, was screaming. He had no plan, no strategy, only fear. His chicken, panicked beyond reason, was sprinting in circles. A goblin lunged at him with a spear, but Private's war chicken, whether by instinct or sheer dumb luck, flapped its wings and karate-kicked the goblin straight into orbit. The crowd lost its mind. Somewhere in the madness, Skipper spotted the final challenge. At the far end of the arena, sitting atop the biggest, meanest war chicken of them all, was the reigning champion, General Cluckles. 7 feet of pure, terrifying poultry muscle, armored from beak to talon in spiked metal plating. His rider, A goblin twice as ugly and twice as vicious as the rest pointed a jagged lance straight at Skipper. This was the final battle. The fate of the penguins hung in the balance. The trumpets blew once more. They exploded again, obviously. And the final joust began. Skipper tightened his grip. Rico howled in excitement. Kowalski mentally calculated the weight-to-speed ratio of an armored super chicken. And Private? Private simply closed his eyes and prayed. 2 sides, 1 match, and only 1 winner. The air was thick with tension, dust, and the faint smell of whatever questionable goblin snacks were being deep-fried in the stands. Skipper and his war chicken faced off against General Cluckles, the reigning champion of chicken jousting. The goblins chanted wildly, stomping their tiny feet as the 2 competitors stood at opposite ends of the jousting arena. The announcer Goblin, now coughing out soot from his latest trumpet explosion, waved a tiny flag to signal the beginning of the final match. And then it happened. Cluckles charged. It wasn't a normal charge. This was an unnatural, apocalyptic stampede of thunderous poultry fury. His chicken exploded forward at terrifying speed, its armored wings flaring out like battle shields. The ground quaked beneath its monstrous talons. Skipper barely had time to react before his own chicken was yanked forward by some invisible force. Weight, not invisible. Rico had somehow strapped a miniature jet engine onto Skipper's chicken. The result? A rocket-powered penguin joust of doom. They collided mid-air. Bam! The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the arena. Goblin popcorn vendors were blasted into the stands. A random goblin cartwheeled into a cauldron of stew. Even Kowalski's beak was temporarily misaligned from the sheer magnitude of the collision. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. And then Skipper's chicken flinched. A fatal mistake. Cluckles saw the opening and struck. With a war cry that could shatter reality itself, the giant battle chicken spun in a full 360-degree motion mid-air, raising its titanic armored claw. Skipper's eyes widened. This wasn't jousting anymore. This was a full-blown battle of ancient chicken sorcery. With an earth-shaking screech, Cluckles swung his mighty claw and missed. Not because of Skipper, not because of a tactical dodge, but because Private's war chicken had somehow gotten in the way and headbutted General Cluckles. In the beak, silence. Utter, complete, incomprehensible silence. The goblin audience sat in stunned disbelief. Even Kowalski dropped his chalkboard of battle calculations. The mighty General Cluckles, undefeated champion of goblin chicken jousting, blinked once. Twice. Then, with an exhausted, slightly dazed cluck, he fainted, face first into the dirt. The goblin crowd exploded into chaos. Some were screaming. Some were weeping tears of joy. Others were throwing questionable amounts of fireworks into the air, ignoring the immediate fire hazards. The penguins had won, or more specifically, Private's extremely confused chicken had won. Rico tackled Private in a dramatic, victorious hug. Skipper, dusting off his battle-worn feathers, merely gave a knowing nod. And Kowalski? He just looked at his ruined chalkboard, sighed, and muttered something about statistical impossibilities. But then, something rumbled. Something deep beneath the arena. The goblins went dead silent, because the final challenge was about to begin. A deep mechanical growl echoed through the underground tunnels. And then, boom! The entire center of the arena collapsed. From the depths of the earth, surrounded by rising steam and flickering flames, came the true final opponent. The reigning goblin champion. Not just any goblin. A giant, goblin-powered mech. 50 feet tall, fueled entirely by pure chaos and questionable engineering. The goblins roared in absolute excitement. The penguins? They simply stared up at the terrifying metal monstrosity and realized they might not survive this next round. The ground trembled beneath the penguins as the colossal goblin-powered mech roared to life. Its rusted iron plates clanked, gears turned with violent screeches, and glowing green goblin energy pulsed from mystical runes scrawled all over its metal body. At its core sat an entire control room packed with goblins, each frantically pulling levers, smashing buttons, and arguing over who got to steer. Then, with a thunderous hiss of steam, the mech's massive mechanical fists clenched. A goblin announcer screamed into his megaphone, Final challenge, begin! And all chaos broke loose. The mech lurched forward, shaking the ground like an earthquake. The penguins had no time to think. Boom! A gargantuan metal foot came crashing down. The team scattered just in time, barely avoiding being turned into penguin pancakes. Skipper, ever the strategist, assessed the enemy. This wasn't just a machine. It was a walking disaster of goblin engineering. The arms? Too long, uneven, and barely attached. The legs? One was a steam-powered piston. The other was suspiciously just a very large wooden peg. The head? A giant goblin skull. That was on fire for no reason. This thing was a ticking time bomb, and Kowalski knew exactly how to make it tick faster. He pulled a small notebook from nowhere and began scribbling calculations at light speed. Meanwhile, Rico was already in motion. He had somehow strapped 20 rockets to his back, fully prepared to launch himself into the mech, like a flying bowling ball of destruction. Skipper stopped him. Not yet. They needed a plan. But the mech wasn't waiting. With a loud hissing sound, it lifted its oversized metal fist, a fist the size of a small house, and swung downward. Boom! The arena shook violently as dust and debris filled the air. But when the dust settled, the penguins were gone. The goblin audience gasped in shock. Had they been crushed? Had the legendary flightless warriors been flattened into penguin-flavored jam? Because when the smoke cleared, the penguins were not under the fist. They were on top of the mech. While the goblins had been distracted, they had scaled the machine like expert commandos. Now, they clung to its metal plates, climbing higher and higher, aiming for the core. The goblin pilots inside, realizing what was happening, panicked. They're on the mech! Activate the anti-climb protocol. A goblin slammed a big red button. Immediately, the mech's entire body started spinning like a tornado. Skipper and the team held on for dear life. Metal plates whipped past them, steam vents exploded, and worst of all, goblin disco music started blasting from hidden speakers. Private screamed internally. Kowalski, barely hanging on, finished his calculations. Then, he yelled something important at Skipper. Skipper nodded once. The plan was set, and it was ridiculously dangerous. They just needed Rico to do what he did best. Explode things. Skipper signaled to Rico. Rico, already frothing with excitement, reached into his mouth and pulled out a dynamite stick, then another, and another, and another. Somehow, his entire mouth was now overflowing with explosives. Perfect! The goblin pilots, realizing too late what was happening, screamed in terror. But there was no stopping Rico now. With one final unhinged cackle, he spat every single explosive into the mech's control room. And then, boom! A cataclysmic explosion tore through the mech, lighting up the sky with green flames and flying goblins. The penguins, blown clear from the blast, tumbled through the air, straight toward the winner's podium. As they landed in a perfect four-point hero pose, the goblin announcer blinked in stunned silence. Then, slowly, he lifted his microphone and declared, "New Goblin Olympic champions, the Penguins!" The crowd went berserk. Fireworks exploded. Goblins launched themselves out of cannons in celebration. It was official. The Penguins had won the Goblin Olympics. But the celebration was short-lived. Because suddenly, a deep, menacing shadow loomed over the stadium. Something far, far worse than the mech had arrived. Something that made even the goblins tremble in fear. The Goblin King himself had come, and he was not happy. A deep rumbling shook the ground as a monstrous figure emerged from the shadows. The Goblin King, towering 3 times the size of an ordinary goblin, his armor was made of gold-plated bones, stolen wizard staffs, and what suspiciously looked like an entire dragon's skull. His crown? A glowing meteorite chunk, barely staying on his massive, wrinkled green head. The goblin crowd fell into complete silence. This was not part of the tournament. The king of all goblins never left his underground throne, and yet, here he was. His yellow eyes burned with fury as he stomped toward the wreckage of the goblin mech. The penguins, still dusted in mech debris, stared up at him. Skipper had faced down mutant jellyfish, exploding robots, and a hyper-intelligent dolphin bent on world domination. But this felt different. The Goblin King growled, his voice like distant thunder. "Who dares desecrate my mech? Who dares cheat the Goblin Olympics?" The Goblin announcer shook violently, staring at the penguins in horror. He had just crowned them champions, which meant the Goblin King's wrath was now entirely their problem. The Goblin audience, sensing that this was about to turn into a full-scale disaster, slowly started backing away. Even the other competitors, goblins who moments ago were hurling fireballs at each other, began quietly sneaking out of the arena. The penguins were alone. Rico, unbothered, was already digging in his mouth for more explosives. Skipper grabbed his flipper before he could pull out an entire rocket launcher. Not yet. Kowalski, brain going into overdrive, scanned the arena for a possible escape route. There was only one way out, and it was very, very stupid. But so was everything else they had done today. The Goblin King took another thundering step forward. Then, Kowalski flipped open his notebook and pointed toward the sky. "The Goblin King's throne!" he had written in frantic, messy letters. Skipper understood immediately. The penguins didn't have to fight. They just had to distract him long enough to steal his throne. Because according to Goblin Law number 27, anyone who sits on the throne automatically becomes the new king, even if they were, technically, a 4-foot-tall penguin with questionable leadership skills. It was their only shot. And it had to happen now. Skipper gave the signal. Private grabbed a handful of goblin fireworks from the wreckage. Rico set them on fire. And then, boom! The sky exploded into a dazzling, chaotic mess of colors and screaming goblins. The Goblin King flinched, momentarily blinded. That was all they needed. With an unholy burst of penguin speed, they launched themselves toward the Goblin King's floating throne. It was massive, gold-plated, and covered in hundreds of mysterious levers, buttons, and gears. And it was hovering 20 feet in the air. No problem. Kowalski yanked a grappling hook from Rico's belly. Skipper fired it. The rope latched onto the throne's armrest, and the penguins, holding on for dear life, swung through the air like a high-speed wrecking ball. They landed, tumbled, and slammed directly into the royal seat. Silence. The Goblin King froze. The goblins froze. Even Rico, who had been midway through swallowing a bomb, froze. The announcer's microphone slipped from his hands. Then, in the most dramatic moment in Goblin history, the throne let out a magical chime. And then, a holographic banner exploded above them, flashing in bright neon green. New Goblin King detected. The goblins erupted into chaos. "The prophecy is true! The penguins have taken the throne. All hail King Skipper!" The Goblin King stared in horror. His massive fingers twitched. His whole body trembled. He opened his mouth, and then he disappeared. Vanished. Poof, gone. The throne had teleported him into exile. Because according to Goblin Law number 28, the moment a new king is crowned, the old one is magically banished to the nearest goblin dungeon, which meant the penguins had actually won. They were the new rulers of Goblin Kingdom. And as the goblins began cheering, throwing confetti, and playing cursed bagpipes, Skipper sat in the throne, completely stone-faced. They had technically succeeded. But now they had a much, much bigger problem, because being king of the goblins meant they were never allowed to leave. And the first order of business, organizing the next Goblin Olympics, Skipper's eye twitched. The penguins had survived dinosaurs, exploding robots, and evil supervillains. But nothing could have prepared them for the chaotic nightmare of goblin politics. And with that, the story of the Penguins and the Goblin Olympics ended not with a victory march, but with Skipper face-palming so hard, his entire soul left his body.
If you like this video, then do subscribe to this channel